There are approximately 5,000 active satellites orbiting Earth right now as you watch this video. 5,000 man-made objects circling the planet at 28,000 kilometers per hour. But that number is about to become irrelevant, because just one company, a single private company, is in the process of putting an additional 42,000 satellites into low Earth orbit. 42,000. To give you a visual comparison, if you stacked all the commercial airplanes that exist in the entire world today, that would be about 25,000 aircraft. SpaceX's Starlink plans to put almost twice that number in the sky, in orbit, permanently. And when you look at the night sky 10 years from now, what you will see will not be the same sky that humanity has observed for 300,000 years of existence. It will be another sky, built by a private corporation, without you voting on it, without being consulted, without anyone asking for your opinion. But that's not the story you expected to hear. You expected me to talk about UFOs. I was expecting the classic narrative of lights in the sky that have no explanation, and I understand. Because that's exactly what it looks like when you see it for the first time, a perfect row of luminous points silently crossing the sky, evenly spaced, all moving in the same direction, at the same speed, like a snake of light crossing the night. People film it. People call the fire department. People post on social media in panic. This happens every week somewhere in the world. And the answer is simple. They are newly launched Starlink satellites. This is documented. This is public. But what is not being discussed is what this infrastructure represents beyond satellite internet. And that's exactly what we're going to investigate. Because if you only focus on the UFO part, you'll miss the real story. And the real story is much more important and much more disturbing. So the question that will guide the next few minutes is not what those lights are. That question already has an answer. The question is, who decides what orbits planet Earth? Who controls access to space? Who determines the rules about what can and cannot be put into orbit? And what happens when the answer to all these questions starts to become a private company? There is a theory, and I will use the word theory precisely because I will distinguish fact from hypothesis from speculation at all times. There is a theory called asymmetric orbital colonization. It is not a science fiction term. It is a concept discussed in international space law publications, in academic papers from universities like MIT and Oxford, and in reports from organizations like the International Telecommunication Union. The idea is this: orbital space around Earth is a finite resource. Low orbits have limited capacity. And contrary to what most people believe, there is no robust legal system that prevents a private entity from occupying a disproportionate share of this resource. The 1967 Outer Space Treaty prohibits nations from claiming sovereignty over celestial bodies, but it doesn't mention private companies, and it doesn't mention satellites in orbit. That's a fact, verifiable, with treaty number and everything. Now comes the detail that shouldn't exist. In 2019, when Starlink began launching its first satellite constellations, astronomers around the world began reporting a problem that no one had seriously predicted. The satellites were too bright, too reflective. They interfered with astronomical observations. The Vera C. Rubin Observatory and Chileo telescope, designed to map the entire universe in 10 years, with $473 million in funding from the US government, published a study estimating that Starlink satellites would contaminate between 30% and 40% of its long-exposure images. 30 to 40% of a $473 million scope, funded with public money, compromised by satellites from a private company. And SpaceX's official response was, "We'll try to make the satellites less reflective. Try, on a scale of 42,000 satellites." Wait a minute. A private company can compromise the capacity for global astronomical observation, and the regulatory response is, shall we try? Where are the limits? Who defines the limits? And if there are no defined limits before the entire infrastructure is in place, who will have the political courage to dismantle it afterward? I went looking for these answers, and what I found was a regulatory system that was not prepared for what is happening. The American FCC Federal Communications Commission approved Starlink's licenses, but the FCC regulates American telecommunications, not global orbital space. The International Telecommunication Union, which would be the closest thing to international regulation, operates by consensus among member countries and has no enforcement power. The Outer Space Treaty, as I mentioned, was written in 1967, when private satellites on a scale of tens of thousands were science fiction. The international legal system that governs who can put what into orbit was designed for a world where only nation-states had that capability. This world no longer exists since 2015, when SpaceX began launching and landing reusable rockets, completely changing the economics of access to space. And international law has not yet updated itself. This is not a hypothesis. It is what space law experts from elite universities describe in papers published over the past 5 years. I will clearly separate what is fact from what is hypothesis and what is speculation. Facts. Starlink has approval to launch up to 42,000 satellites into low Earth orbit, approval granted by the FCC. The Vera C. Rubin Observatory estimated contamination of 30 to 40% of its images by Starlink satellites, a study published and peer-reviewed. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 does not provide for regulation of private companies in orbit. The International Telecommunication Union has no enforcement power over private launches. Currently, there are more than 5,000 active satellites in orbit, most of them Starlink. Hypotheses supported by evidence that the current pace of launches will make it technically impossible to impose retroactive regulatory limits without negotiations of enormous diplomatic proportions. The window for creating an effective legal framework is closing as the infrastructure solidifies. Speculation without a solid factual basis, that there is a deliberate intention to monopolize orbital space as a coordinated geopolitical strategy. I have no evidence to support this, and I will not present it as fact. Now think about the real consequences of what you just heard. Astronomy is not just academic science. It is our ability to detect asteroids that could collide with Earth. It is our ability to monitor changes in the solar system. It is our ability to respond to threats coming from space before it is too late. NASA's Planetary Defense Program relies on long-exposure telescopes that map the night sky for near-Earth objects. If 30 to 40% of the images from these telescopes are compromised by reflection from commercial satellites, our ability to detect threats early decreases proportionally. And this is not speculation. It is physics. It is geometry. That's what astronomers with decades of experience have been saying in scientific publications since 2019. But there's a second consequence that almost no one is discussing. Low orbital space is becoming congested. This creates a risk of cascading collisions, the so-called Kessler syndrome, where a single collision event generates debris that causes other collisions, which generate more debris, in a chain reaction that can render certain orbits unusable for decades. Donald Kessler, the NASA scientist who described this risk in 1978, is still alive. And in recent interviews, he described the current pace of launches as worrying in relation to the risk he modeled 45 years ago. I know what you might be thinking now, but satellite internet connects people in remote regions of the world who never had access. That's real, and it's genuinely important. I'm not saying the technology is bad. I'm asking who controls the technology, under what rules it operates, and who pays the cost of the externalities it creates. Global connectivity is a genuine good. But global connectivity controlled by a single private company, without effective international regulation, with astronomical and environmental costs distributed to all of humanity, while the profits are privatized. That's a different equation. And it's the equation that nobody is putting in simple terms in public debates. But there is a question that nobody is asking, and that question changes the whole perspective. The question is not, are Starlink satellites good or bad? That's a question that has two reasonable sides, and you can argue on both sides. The forbidden question is this: what if the night sky is a common good of humanity, like the ocean, like the atmosphere, like the ozone layer, and it's being privatized without anyone realizing that's what was happening? Think about the logic. You can't build an oil refinery in the Pacific Ocean without an international license because the ocean is a common good. You can't pollute the atmosphere without incurring international treaties because the atmosphere is a common good. But you can apparently fill low Earth orbit with 42,000 reflective objects that compromise the observation capabilities of all humanity, and the regulatory response is let's try to improve the coding on the satellites. In May 2021, more than 40 international astronomical organizations signed a joint statement calling for urgent regulation of megascale satellite constellations. The statement was sent to the UN, the FCC, and the International Telecommunication Union. In 2023, the IAU, the International Astronomical Union, the world's leading astronomy body, published a formal report on the impact of commercial satellites on astronomical observation, describing the situation as an unprecedented threat to humanity's astronomical heritage. Humanity's heritage. That's the vocabulary serious astronomers are using, not radical environmentalists, not conspiracy theorists. Astronomers with decades of experience and publications in Nature and Science. And this report was covered by almost no mainstream media outlet, because it's a problem that doesn't have a convenient villain, doesn't have immediate political drama, and isn't solved in a news cycle. And then I understood. The problem isn't that the lights in the sky are UFOs. The problem is that the lights in the sky are real, they're man-made, and they're permanently changing something that belonged to all of us without anyone asking permission. So what do you do with that? First, the next time you see a string of lights streaking across the night sky, you'll know exactly what it is. Knowing what it is doesn't eliminate the question of whether it should be there. Second, there's a tool called Heavens Above, a free, public website where you can track in real time all satellites visible to the naked eye over your location, including the Starlink constellations. Using it is an act of space citizenship. Third, the debate about regulating private satellites is happening now in international bodies, and the window to influence that debate is still open. But it's closing as the infrastructure consolidates. Fourth, support professional astronomy organizations that are producing data and publications on this topic. They don't have the marketing budget of a company worth hundreds of billions of dollars. But they have the data. You've probably seen a Starlink satellite without knowing what it was. Maybe you stood there staring at the sky for a few seconds, trying to understand what you were seeing. Maybe you filmed it. Maybe you researched it. And the technical answer is simple. They are satellites. But the complete answer is much more complex. They are satellites that represent the greatest transformation in the appearance of the night sky since humankind has existed. They are satellites that are being placed into orbit faster than international law can keep up with. They are satellites that create distributed externalities for all of humanity while the benefits are captured by a private company. And they are satellites that, once in place on a scale of tens of thousands, will be virtually impossible to remove without a global diplomatic crisis. That's the story of the lights you've probably seen. And the question that will stay with you after this video ends is this. If the night sky were a national park, would you accept a private company installing 42,000 advertising panels within it without public approval? Because that's exactly what's happening, with the difference that a national park has laws protecting it. And heaven still doesn't have it.